I've always found it fascinating how in the fighting game community, we often use words like baiting, mix-ups, mind games, as well as that oh-so-cool buzzword called conditioning. Because on the surface, there's only one rat in the game, and it's the one that does the shocking of the other player. I come from a background in competitive chess, and it took me a while to get used to these concepts. Because in Smash, we often talk about players doing things like dashing forwards and then wave dashing backwards as a bait, but in chess there is no such analogy. Not only is moving a knight forwards and then backwards completely meaningless, it'll get you sent to the gulags by an old bearded Russian coach. In fact, the game that arguably shares the closest mentality to fighting games in this regard is poker, a world where people talk about triple barrel bluffs, YOLO all-ins, and hero calls. And this is such a strange concept, because why would a game where you can see everything share any similarities with a game whose fundamental premise revolves around having cards that are invisible to your opponent? I want to take a second to highlight this characterization of Melee, because while it's technically true, in practice, it's actually a lie. Melee is not a game of perfect information at a human level. This is the part where you're supposed to groan, because this is now the 4th time that I've talked about the human reaction time on this channel. But gab nabbit, I'm gonna do it again, and you can't stop me. Fleshy meatbags often take up to 250 milliseconds to process visual stimuli, and in 60 frame per second games, this is a 15 frame window of pure unreactability. This might seem trivial, this is literally a quarter of a second, but in practice, this means that if we see a plucky space pilot just chilling anywhere near us on stage, we don't know what they're going to do. They could dash for 7 frames, enter jump squat for 1 frame, and then cancel jump squat into an up smash, which will fit within 15 frames. Or go through that exact same process but for grab. Or do something even faster, like a short hop nair at any number of drifts or timings, or a full hop, or shield, or dash back, or anything else you can think of. And despite Mr. McCloud being the character with the fastest frame data in the cast, pretty much every character in Melee has a whole lot of meaningful options they can threaten within 15 frames. Except, arguably this large bucket. And so when I say Melee isn't a game of perfect information at a human level, I mean that in any given moment, players are not only worried about what's happening now, but what's going to happen next. And as a result, it doesn't make sense to treat a freeze frame of Melee like a chess puzzle, where we can figure out the quote-unquote optimal option that we can spam every time, and then calculate 60 moves ahead while we make our horsey draw squiggles in our opponent's territory. But in reality, it becomes this strange dance where we can't really be sure what our opponents are going to do. And so generally speaking, top players will pick a few really strong options to mix up between. And this word mix-up is the word of the day, because ultimately fighting games can be boiled down into a long series of interactions that really does resemble high-speed poker hands. I like to cover both neutral and poker at 3 levels of increasing complexity. The first level is where we disregard any mental part of the game and just learn to play solidly. The second is one where we exploit players who just play straightforwardly with reads, while making sure to stay unpredictable ourselves. And the third is one where we exploit players who are reading us by baiting and conditioning behaviors that we can take advantage of. So bear with me a bit, because before we can get to the juicy stuff, we need to eat our vegetables. Specifically, despite pop culture really propping up poker as this insane battle of wits, where everyone's always freaking out about tells and shoving chips into the middle of the table, poker is low-key just a math puzzle for big dweebs. I read a book a while back called The Theory of Poker, which funnily enough shaped a lot of the thoughts I now have about fighting games. I am sort of not sure if I would recommend the book unless you were really into card games, because it's dense and he wanders into a lot of rabbit holes talking about random stuff, sort of like how I am now. But one of the most interesting parts of the book was that it opened my eyes to how mathy poker really is. And in fact, the author doesn't even mention the fact that poker is a game of deception until chapter 8, and before then talks about nerd concepts like pot odds and bet sizing. And similarly, in Melee, I wish that before I spent 5 solid years of my life overcomplicating neutral and going for weird options, someone had just taught me a rough understanding of risk and reward. We can summarize risk as being a function of how much lag the moves we select put us in, and how close we are to our opponent when we are unactionable. This is the primary reason why smash attacks are usually no bueno in neutral. They are laggy, and usually end up putting us right into our opponent's loving arms. And most of the time, pro players will be really careful to select moves that are relatively non-committal, and space them such that they maintain their effectiveness while being as far away as possible. This makes it almost impossible for opponents to get guaranteed punishes, and at best, a slightly favorable mix-up. And it would be so cool if there existed some sort of vocabulary or something, maybe some concept that would help us talk about how risky a move is in neutral. Anyway, if any of y'all come up with something for that, let me know. Reward is a little harder to conceptualize in a game like Melee, but as a rough framework, the highest reward possible in any micro situation of Melee is killing your opponent, and after that, it's generally knocking them off stage for an edgeguard, which has a high probability of netting a kill. And then after that, it's hitting a combo starter that will rack up tons of percent, which will make it easier to do the other two. Top players use its loose prioritization in tandem with the game state, using things like where their opponent is on stage and their current percent to figure out what moves they should be selecting that will net them the most off of an opening. This is pretty hilariously demonstrated by this commentary clip of Leffen rap godding out all the kill subs going through his head at this particular point in the match.
And 45% of this stage, it's significant. Weak air, up smash, up tilt, up air, down tilt, up air, down air, grab, up air.
And similarly, Squid once told me in a coaching session that the way he views the Fox-Falco matchup is that under 35%, Fox has literally 4 moves: drill, grab, shine, and up smash. And if he gets hit by a move that's not one of these 4, he holds down, reversals the situation, and smites them for their sins. Melee is deceptively complicated in that players need to be hyper aware of their punish flowcharts to know what is possible in any given situation and what they should be going for, on top of just executing and moving perfectly. And all of these aspects of the game factor into a massive risk-reward calculation that players make snap judgments about in-game. It's subtle, but even the smallest changes can affect everything, like how the moment Jigglypuff crosses around 91%, Fox can no longer up-throw up air for a kill reliably, and that kill sub just goes off the table until the next stock. All of this is to say that before any player ventures into the human element of just playing their opponent, they need to have a solid foundation in this more mechanical side of neutral, of just being able to judge at any point in time what they should be going for and what their game plan should be. But of course, just being so straightforward has its downsides too. Just because a move will kill at any point in time doesn't mean it's always the right thing to do. And that leads us to the second layer of play. There is a general rule of thumb that exists in all games of deception, which is that if your opponent knows what you're going to do, it's probably the wrong thing to do. And this runs counter to a huge misconception I see in newer players, which is the idea that in any micro situation of Melee, there's a single optimal option that should be spammed every time. In poker, there is a literal opportunity cost to being predictable. If you always just play to the perceived strength of your hand, then you allow me to have perfect information and play optimally around you, while keeping my hands hidden. I'll know exactly when to fold and when to raise, and worse for you, I can go for massive outplays, because I'll know exactly when you're not feeling that confident in your hand, and I can steal a pot away with a huge bluff. And in Smash, players will often try to be unpredictable and neutral. I think the funniest example of this is Mewtwo King versus IBDW, where in a last stock situation, Mewtwo King goes for an empty short hop sour spot forward smash to catch IBDW jumping out of shield at an off timing, which he then converts into an edge guard to clutch the set. It is one of the strangest options he could have represented there, and it's something you would never catch a more disciplined Marth like Zane ever do in neutral. And yet, in this one micro situation, it was perfect and it sealed the set. In both neutral and poker, if we represent wide ranges of playstyles in any situation, we'll have a higher chance of catching our opponent off guard, which will lead to them picking the wrong moves for the situation, DIing wrong, and tilting off the face of the earth. And when I say to be unpredictable, I don't even mean to represent running full hop reverse falcon punch, but even when we're doing simpler tasks, like controlling the space in front of us, it helps a ton to mix things up once in a while. Check out this clip of Zane playing defensively and waiting for his opponent to approach. Even though he isn't doing anything insane, he mixes up between dash dances and short hop aerials, trying to be mildly unpredictable. Because imagine if you were to just short hop aerial in place over and over again. I could pretty easily call out his short hop aerial timing with a move like up smash, which is normally very risky because of how much end lag it puts me in, but works great for a situation like this. But because I don't know the timing at which the Marth is short hop aerialing, up smashing becomes really risky. If I'm early, I get dash dance grabbed, and if I'm late, I get stuffed by the short hop aerial. By Zane simply mixing up when he short hop aerials, he heavily skews the risk reward of my YOLO all in, and ends up getting away with throwing out hitboxes even if they're theoretically punishable. And similarly, Mango always mixes up how he attacks at his opponent, doing running shine, running aerial, running shield, or sometimes just chilling for a bit to see what his opponent's up to. This is extremely effective because every piece of his offense beats and loses to a different set of options, and by doing a little bit of everything, his opponent never knows what to expect next. And of course, we can make fun reads too by paying attention to what our opponents are doing in game. I think it would be overwhelming to adapt our entire game plans around what we're seeing, but paying attention to really simple decision points, like what our opponents are doing out of shield, or when our opponents like to swing, or if that Falco we're playing approaches after the 99th laser or the 100th laser, can pay huge dividends if we decide to cash in. Against players on unranked, I often try to loosely categorize my opponent by taking mental note of the decisions they're making. Because sure, a god gamer will know every option and represent them at the perfect frequencies to Nash equilibrium, but realistically, most players have habits and tendencies and playstyles, and figuring out what I should actually be afraid of from each opponent helps a ton. This leads to layer 3, which is when both players are familiar with basic theory and are each paying attention to each other's tendencies to get that edge over each other. Here, we can play a more meta level of mind game, reading that our opponent is reading us, to get them to predict something we were never planning on doing, and then exploiting that. Imagine a rock, paper, scissors, where we pretend to throw out rock, making our opponent throw out paper, while we actually throw out scissors instead. This is the essence of baiting and conditioning. And to come full circle, this is why dashing forwards and wave dashing backwards is meaningful. Our opponent expects us to do something with a dash forward, does something in response, and then we cash in on their suboptimal reaction. One advancement in the Fox Ditto meta that got particularly popular a while back was when players started going for dash dance, short hop, fade back drill, with the idea that this is a move that is virtually indistinguishable on the fly from an attack that's drifting totally forwards. And not only was a drift back drill, generally speaking, pretty safe, it would often catch players trying to react to an incoming aerial trying to bite, and the Fox player would cash in on baiting a bait. Another popular example of this is Mango setting an expectation of committing heavily on shield by wailing away with low aerials, drifting forwards, and then in a maneuver that's called the Mango, does an early aerial drifting full back, baiting out an overcommitment out of shield, which he then punishes, often with an F smash. When we play against experienced players, we can be sure that they'll be loosely tracking our habits, hoping to cut corners to make neutral easier for themselves. The simple act of expecting us to continue doing whatever we've been doing so far means that our opponent is essentially conditioning themselves to play predictably, as long as we can maintain this meta-awareness of what we've represented so far in the set. This is complicated, but in essence it comes down to recognizing when the gears are turning in our opponent's heads, and then using the speed of the game to mess with their ability to predict what's coming next. These more advanced levels of mind games, where players start reading that their opponents are reading a read, are the cherry on top of the whipped cream that has more basic adaptations, which is stacked on the fudge of defensively representing a wide range of options, which sits on top of a base foundational layer, which is playing the risk-reward. The neutral game is complicated, and it gets messy, and it melts over time and gives you diabetes over the long run. And if it is all very overwhelming, I think it can be helpful to just stick with one core takeaway, which is that fighting games are incredibly interactive games where we need to remember that we are playing against a living, breathing opponent, except in the cases where you're playing against the Terminator, but there you're on your own. But more seriously, all this talk about baits and reads should make us realize that the actions we take in game not only change the game state, but also make our opponents feel a certain way. Shooting a bunch of lasers does more than just 3% increments and small pockets of hit stun, but will also completely warp the way our opponent decides to play the game. And going in with a YOLO attack can oftentimes do more mental damage than actual physical percent. Us icky, imperfect humans are habit driven, and it only gets even more extreme when there's bajillions of dollars on the line and everyone is watching. But if you're playing for stakes that high, chances are you already know all this stuff and are actually not watching this video. Thanks for watching. Okay, I'm gonna start using the end of these videos more creatively. We're not gonna just say thank you and peddle socials or whatever. I'm gonna start sharing things that I learned about, self-improvement or whatever in the last week. And if y'all feel like sharing things that you learned, also feel free to drop in the comments. I read every single one, honestly, because I'm so small. But this week I was learning how tight my hands get when I play in bracket and I get nervous and I really start death gripping my controller. And I was wondering why there were certain inputs that I was doing, ledge dashes require pretty precise, fine-tuned movements, as opposed to, I don't know, if there's rock climbing or whatever. And I realized that, the tighter my hands get, the harder it is to do these things. And so I've been sort of actively practicing with looser hands. So, again, I don't know, what did you learn? Let's hear it. Peace out.